Once your patterns are cut, we're going to go ahead and prepare our fabrics, and we're going to overlock the edges first. What we want to do is we want to fuse the back of the fly, and then we're going to overlock that edge. We're going to overlock the edges of our front facing for the pocket and our back overlay for the front pocket. We're going to overlock the inside leg seam, and then we're going to overlock up to the fly where the notch is. You can go ahead and I'll go all the way up, that just creates more bulk. Not a big deal, but something to be mindful of. On the back, we're going to go overlock the back rise, the inseam, and the side seam. We're also going to overlock the back overlay at the bottom of it, and then we're going to overlock the bottom of the lower piping when we make the double welt pocket. Once the edges are overlocked, our first order of operation is simply to go and sew our dart. We have a back dart. Take that, fold our legs together. We're going to sew the edges. We're going to sew to 1/2 inch beyond the back off. Once that's done, we'll press those seam allowances toward center back, and then we're going to go ahead and place a piece of fusing right there to cover that area so that it's supported when we get ready to place our pockets. Once the back darts have been sewn, the balance of the dart has been pressed towards center back, and then your fusible has been put in place, you're ready to start working on the piping for the welt pockets. What we want to do is we want to mark from reference point to reference point, and then my welt pockets are 5 1/4 inches long, so 2 5/8 inches on one side and 2 5/8 inches to the other side. I'm going to place marks vertically so I know where my welts need to finish. Now if you're working with a welt pocket that has a flap, make your flap first to verify that it's going to be the same length, because sometimes when you sew them they come out a little bit shorter or a little bit longer. So we're going to use this as our reference instead. We're going to mark this side and mark this side. Once you've done that, then the next step is to go ahead and place your front pocketing for the back pocket. Sounds a little odd, but it's the one that's going to be closest to the body of the pant. What we want to do is just find the center point. So I just crease my pocket. I'm going to open up my pant here, place the pocket where I want it to be. I have a little excess at the top I'm going to cut away later on. Your pattern may or may not have that. But I want to make certain that this crease line follows my dart line. And that way then I can get it pinned into place to hold it. So we're going to sew the piping to the front of the pant, and then we'll sew it to the pocketing at the same time. And this is what it will look like on the inside. Okay? Once you're at this step, then you're ready to go ahead and do the double welt pockets. I'm sewing the bottom piping face down, where the overlocked edge is this side. That's what indicates the bottom piping. The top piping does not have any overlock edge on it. And we're going to backstitch. And stop precisely at our marking. Then remember, we want to keep this torqued just a little bit. We want to keep it on a bit of an arc so that the welt smiles, so it follows the contour of the body more nicely. It is important to sew it at 1/4 inch. At the bottom of the arc, that's about 1/8 inch away from my original line. And then I will arc back up. Now your bottom pocketing is in place. Make certain it doesn't fold back on itself as you're sewing. And when we get to the other end, we'll backstitch. And then we're ready to do the upper welt. Place this. And what I want to do is make certain that I mark precisely at the end so I don't overshoot that area. Otherwise, when I finish, my welt pipings will not be square on the ends. They'll be a little tilted. Again, we're sewing this one 1/4 inch away from the edge, and we're making certain that the edges of the welt kiss one another. There's no space there. we go on, we'll check our work to verify they're the same at both ends. Stop about 3/8 from the end, and then clip on the angle. Clip through everything except the piping. And right to the stitches, but not through them. Right to the stitches, but not through them. Same thing on the other end. About 3/8 of an inch before the end. The self and the pocketing, but don't clip the piping. There we go. Now we're ready for the next step. And the next step is pressing. We're going to press these seam allowances open, just as the instructions show in the other video. So you're going to bring the piping toward the opening and then press the seam allowance open. Once you've done that, roll that to the inside, and then we'll finish this with a hand work. Okay. We'll do the same thing on the bottom. Bring the piping up toward the pocket opening, press the seam allowances open, bring it to the inside, and then we'll finish this piping as well by hand. Once you've sewn your piping, sewn those triangles in place as well, you're also going to make certain that you sew what becomes the front facing, which is part of the lower piping, right? We're going to sew that to the pocket. Okay, that little edge right there that's been overlocked so it can't move. It's going to be a little shorter than the ends, and that's fine because we don't want to catch all that bulk in the seam allowances when we get ready to sew it. The next step, however, is to go ahead and sew either a buttonhole or put a loop into place. So if you're doing a buttonhole, and I would do that if I was doing a flap, I'm going to go ahead and sew my buttonhole here first before moving on, and I want to go ahead and sew through all the layers. Okay, and then if I'm doing a loop, this can wait till later. However, it's just going to get placed right there, and I would simply baste it right in the seam allowance right there to hold it in place until it gets sewn in the final step. Our buttonhole's been placed and opened, our loop's been placed and temporarily basted into place. The next step is to go ahead and determine where our back overlay for the back of the pocketing is going to be, and I find the easiest thing to do is simply turn it over, and we want this back overlay to capture at the top here. So our seam allowance is right there, so about 1/2 of an inch above the opening for the pocket will be ample. That tells me where it needs to go. Now what I'm going to do is just place my back pocketing so that it matches up with everything else. And I'm just simply going to pin through and capture my overlay fabric. Now I know where the placement needs to be. I'm going to go ahead and center it, and I'm going to sew close to the upper edge, which will get captured later on in all this other stuff on the top of the pocket, and then we're going to sew across the bottom to hold that in place. We'll do that for both pockets, and then we're ready for the next step. Our back overlay has been sewn into place. Now we want to go ahead and place it on the back of the pocketing. And if you wanted to, you could simply capture this now and sew all the way around using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then overlock those edges. But a cleaner finish and nicer is to do a French seam. So what we want to do is take the wrong sides, okay, or the outside of the pockets, and place them together. It's going to feel a little awkward, but it works. What you're going to do is you're going to sew it 1/8 of an inch all the way around, and you'll keep going. And your pants will be way up here, but you'll have those edges all sewn at 1/8 of an inch. Then we'll flip it, we'll give it a nice press, and we'll sew it at 1/4 of an inch, and that'll capture all the raw edges and give us a nice French seam, which will also stabilize the pocket. And since it's been sewn twice, it'll be more secure over time. Once you've French seamed the pocket all the way around, then you're ready for the next step. For the flap, we want to go ahead and mark where we want the length to be. So we're going to mark that across there to make certain it's parallel. And we're going to place it, and we're simply going to baste it across the top to hold it into place. Okay? And where you choose to baste it, make sure you stay within your welt area, because we're going to want to move this out of the way to be able to sew this all into one place here shortly. So stay in this little section right there. Once that's done, then we are ready for our final steps on the pocket to attach it. My flap's been basted into place inside of the welt, and everything else is prepped to go. All our French seams are done. And what we want to do now is we want to anchor the pocket to the top of the pants. So right now it's billowing open. We don't want that to occur. So it makes sense. What we're going to do is we're going to sew on this side of the piping, across the top, and then down. But we're going to do it from the inside. So what's going to happen is we're going to sew right along this edge here. We're going to pull the top fabric out of the way, sew across this edge as close as we can. When we get to the other end of the welt, we're going to turn and sew there as well to close that top. And then our pocket is ready to go. What I do suggest is go ahead and basting it across the top simply to hold the pocketing to the pants so it doesn't flip around. Then we're ready for our front pockets. Once the back pockets are complete, we've basted across the top and we've trimmed the pocket to match with the waist. We're ready to set those aside. We'll retrieve our fronts, and the first thing we want to do is set our crease. So, finding the notch at the bottom of the pant, fold in half, find the notch at the top, bring those together, and we're going to give ourselves our crease line. We're only going to do that to the fronts because we'll make the backs match to the fronts once we're done with that. Once our front creases are set, we're ready to work on our pockets. First thing we're going to do is take our front facings for the pockets, face down, and place them. We'll take the front pocketing, also face down, and place it on top, aligning them. What we're going to do then is sew them at 1/4 inch away from the edge. We'll turn this, and then we're going to understitch the facing, and then we'll sew this portion of the facing to the pocketing. The back pocketing for the front follows the curve of the hip, and we're going to cut an overlay piece for that that's going to be overlocked, and face up it's going to align there as well. I like to sew this a scant 1/4 inch away from the edge, just to hold it in place all the way around the perimeter. And you'll have the reverse on the other side. We want to make sure we have the mirror image so that we have a left and a right pocket. Once it's been understitched, and again, all the seam allowances are pressed toward the pocketing, so you can see them over here. Then we'll give that a nice press, and then understitching allows the fabric to roll and wrap to the back without any risk of that other fabric from the inside of the facing bleeding out. And that's what we want. I didn't do it in this circumstance, but it's not unusual when we have bias that we want to actually put some twill tape in here, or some tailor's tape right along this edge as we sew it. That keeps us from giving any give over time and gives us better integrity to the pocket. Now that we have that done, we're ready to complete the pocket. We're going to do just like we did for the back pockets. We're going to sew French seams. So what we want to do is put faces together, just to get a sense of how it works. So again, that's how it's going to look when it's done, right? So what we want to do is put outsides together, or the outside of the pockets. We're going to start up here, we're going to bring it around, and we're going to sew 1/8 of an inch. We're going to turn it, and then we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch to finish up that seam, and then we'll have a really nicely finished pocket. I've sewed it in 1/8, I've turned it to the inside edge, I've given it a nice little press, it helps me out a little bit here, and we're sewed 1/4 of an inch from here. Once that's sewn, go ahead and turn it into place. And you want to capture this edge right here and this edge right here to anchor everything so it doesn't move around. Once we've done that, our pockets are complete and we're ready for the zipper. Once you've completed the front pockets, go ahead and overlock that outside edge. So our side seams are all overlocked now as well. Now we're ready for the fly. I'm going to get the fly on the left side. Okay, so what we want is our fly to look like this when we're prepared for it. We want it to be interfaced, and go ahead and overlock this exterior edge. The extension looks like the fly except it's folded over on itself. I've added seam allowances on these two sides so I can fold it together and sew this and turn it face out so it has a cleaner finish. Alternately, you can simply forego the seam allowances and overlock this edge and this edge. We're going to go ahead and take our pants faces together, or right sides together, and from about an inch before the seam line here at the bottom, where the inseams are, to right where the notch is, we're going to sew at 1/2 of an inch. So at our standard seam allowance. So 1/2 inch from here and stop precisely at the notch. So we've sewn right here to the notch and to about an inch before the inseam. Leave that open and stop precisely at the notch. Go and turn it to the face side, and we're going to attach our fly. Align the edges at center front, and we're going to sew 3/8 of an inch in this case, all the way down to right where the notch is, and then backstitch there. Once we've done that, we'll turn everything to the inside and we'll understitch everything to the fly. Now that the fly has been sewn and understitched and it's all in place, we're ready for the extension. Again, we've folded together, we've sewn this edge here, and then we've overlocked this inside edge. Make certain we have our notch still available to us and visible. We'll take our zipper and we're going to place it face up. And we're going to make certain that zipper stop is about 1/4 of an inch above the stop. That's going to allow us to create that little J stitch later on. And if it's too low, you'll end up hitting that stop. So we want to make certain it's placed there. And what we're going to do is favoring it ever so slightly inside the edge. So I like to kind of split the difference of my overlock. I'm going to run a row of stitching right here to hold it in place. Now that I've run a row of stitching close to the edge here, just to anchor the zipper, I'm going to go ahead and attach the extension. What you want to do is faces together. And there's several different ways to do this. You can just roll this back, and then we can just top stitch this into place just like that. Alternately, you can actually sew it into place first, capturing all the edges, making certain we sew right to our notch. Then we turn it to the face side, and then we understitch. I find that a bit more successful myself. Now that our extension, our zipper has been attached, and we've top stitched it into place, all of our notches at the bottom aligning, we're ready for the final steps. Now the benefit to sewing the top at 3/8 of an inch on both sides of the zipper, the extension and the fly, when we sew the seam allowance at the bottom at 1/2 of an inch, it forces those seam allowances at the top to overlap. And that way we don't have to work so hard to make certain that zipper is hidden. Now, this part is the weirdest part, and it's not hard, it's just weird. So what you want to do is likely it would be best to thread baste right here, just to hold that in place if you're having any issues. I'm going to go ahead and pin, just to show you. So we want to pin that right where we want it to overlap. So we want to make sure that everything is covered nicely and that there's no buckling or puckering right here at the bottom. Pinning through all layers. We're going to lift the side with the fly out of the way. You're going to see the fly sitting right here on top of the extension. Now we want to raise the fly up ever so slightly, and we want to grab the zipper tape. Okay, so here's the fly, here's my zipper tape. I'm just grabbing those two pieces, leave the extension out of the way. I'm going to flip those over. Now, my last bit of sewing, I want to sew one stitch very close to the edge of the tape, and then another one close to the edge of the coil. And that brings us pretty close to the end of sewing our zipper. So we're almost finished with our fly. We've just completed those 2 rows of stitching right there. And they don't have to be that exceptionally close to the zipper tape. That zipper tape is going to be covered, so don't worry about that. And if they're too close, it's hard to pull the zipper through. So you're in good shape if they're about a little less than 1/4 inch away from the tape itself. And we're going to place this, and we're ready for the J stitch. And that's going to anchor everything. Classically, that's 1 1/4 inches away from center front. So I'm going to trace a line. And then it's going to curve in so so that it concludes just at that opening right there. And again, we want to make certain that our zipper stop is above that so that when we sew past it, we don't risk hitting it. We have two choices here when sewing it. We can sew from here down toward there, but it's difficult because sometimes that will pucker. Now, if we're hand pick stitching it like we would be doing in our tailoring, that wouldn't be an issue. But in this case, we want to be careful because sometimes we can get a little bubble there. So it's probably a better choice to start here and work in that direction. Make certain that you've pinned everything in place, or hand basted in place is probably a better choice, right? And then you can sew that. Now be mindful down here, we don't want to capture the extension if we can help it when we're sewing that. So we're going to pull that out of our way so we don't. So I've pinned right along the edge here, or thread basted. And then what I did is I pulled the extension out of the way and I pinned it in place too so I don't risk sewing through it. And again, I'm going to start here, I'm going to come up around the curve and I'm going to conclude at the top. We've sewn the J-stitch. There's one final step. We're going to turn it to the inside and we want to grab both the fly and the extension and we want to sew them right across the bottom here. I usually like to go up to just before the curve ends. That way this is anchored and held together. Now that the fly is complete, we're going to retrieve our back pieces, replace them face down, matching notches. We're going to sew our side seams. Press all the seam allowances open until we get to the pocket. I'll explain that when we get there. Do the same thing over here. Sew the side seam, press the seam allowances open until we get to the pocketing area. Our side seams have been sewn. They've been pressed open up until the pocket. Now many people will go ahead and clip this seam allowance and press that open, and then all the seam allowances from the pocket go toward the back of the garment, or the back of the pants in this case. I don't like to clip the seam allowance. It fatigues that little area there, so I just give it a really hard press and fold that fabric. In that case, that works for me pretty well. Now we're ready for sewing our inseams. We're going to bring the inseams together. We're going to match up our notches at the knee, and then we're also going to be careful that our ends match up here as well. Our seam allowance is 1/2 inch on the inseam, and the back is ever so slightly shorter than the front, simply to keep this from sagging. So you want to make certain that you match up your knee notches so that this is precisely sewn, because there's going to be a little bit of extra fabric on the front that we're going to have to ease into the back or stretch the back to fit. Side seams have been sewn. They've been pressed open to the pocket and then pressed toward the back of the garment. The inseams have been sewn and pressed open. We're going to leave the back rise open until we do the waistband. We place 6 belt loops on the pants. Each belt loop is about 3.5 inches long, so make sure you have enough fabric for that. 24 inches is quite fine. You're going to cut your fabric 1 1/4 inches wide for a 3/8 inch finished belt loop. We're going to sew it at 1/4 inch. Before we turn it face out, we're going to press those seam allowances open, turn it face out, give it a nice press, and then cut them to size. Belt loops have been sewn and pressed and cut to shape, 3.5 inches in length, right behind the grain line, away from center front, or the crease line in this case, as well. I'm going to go ahead and pin face down. Another goes at the side seam. And another goes at the dart. Once these have been sewn in place, we're actually going to hand sew a final one at center back. Go ahead and sew these close to the edge just to anchor them for the time being, and then we're ready for the waistband. We're ready to prepare our waistband for installation. We've already placed our belt loops face down, one at the crease line, the grain line, one I place in front of the side seam right next to it, and I place one at that dart at the back right in the center of it. Those are basted on 1/4 inch away from the edge. Now I need to prepare my waistband canvas, and that's canvas and buckram. The canvas is 2.5 inches wide, it's cut on bias, and then the buckram is 1.5 inches wide. You're just going to place the buckram so that it's right center of the canvas, and you're going to stitch close to both edges. Then once we've prepared our canvas, we'll measure our left waistband, add 1/2 inch for the front, and we'll measure our right, adding 1/2 inch for the front. Then we're ready to install. Once you've cut your canvas, then we're going to cut our waistband the same length and the same width as the canvas. And we're going to place the bottom edge. Now this is going to be the bottom. It's going to sew to the pant here. This is going to fold over the top. And what we want to do is simply baste about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge along that bottom edge. Do that for both pieces. Our waistband has been attached to the buckram canvas support for the waist. We're going to line the edges, and we're going to sew at 1/2 of an inch away from the edge. Now if you place your buckram correctly, it'll sit right at 1/2 of an inch. And you want to sew ever so slightly right to the edge of the buckram. Don't sew the buckram. That way when we press it, it'll fold nicely. Be mindful of your belt loops so they don't shift while you're sewing. If you need to place another basting stitch about 1 inch in, that's not a bad choice. And then also when you're getting ready to sew over the zipper, be careful about that. Sometimes you'll break needles, so don't forget to walk the hand wheel when you're doing that. Make certain that you extend 1/2 inch beyond the front and that you conclude right at the center back. Once you attach the waistband and the canvas to the pant, we're going to go ahead and press up, and then we're going to baste along this upper edge, just like I've done here. After we've done that, we're going to take our belt loops and lay them face down, and we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch away from the waistband on the pant portion. That's going to allow our carriers or our belt loops a little bit more space for a belt. Okay, we'll do that. So we'll back stitch that. Now I suggest starting at the middle and going to the edge, then coming back to the other edge, then toward the middle. That way when you cut your threads, they're in the middle. They're not going to have any loose threads on the ends. Once that's been placed, go ahead and fold it up into place and leave it relaxed. Don't pull taut. We just want to relax there, and then we're going to baste close to the edge at the top to anchor it, and then we'll get ready to sew the lining into place. You will be sewing through your pocketing, so be mindful that your pocketing is in place. Our carriers are in place. They've been basted and held temporarily. We're going to go ahead and cut our lining, and that's for a waistband lining. It's going to be the same length and width as our self, and we can go ahead and trim away the excess zipper at this point. I like to leave a couple of teeth above the sewing line and then cut the excess out. When we're attaching the lining, we're going to attach it at the top of the waistband. This time, however, we're not going to sew it at 1/2 of an inch. We're going to sew it at 3/8. We're going to sew it 3/8. That way, when this pulls to the back, it'll wrap underneath and be hidden on the back side. Our lining's been sewn, and we're ready, and I've gone ahead and pressed it across the top just to give it a memory, and we're all good to go here. What we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and sew up the back rise. So turn one leg wrong side out, place the one that is face out or right side out inside of the other one. Now, we'll go ahead and complete our stitching, keeping our seam allowances open at the crotch. We're going to follow our stitching here, align our notches at the back, and then don't forget, you have a 1.5 inch outlet on the back. What we do is fold everything open. We can chalk mark right here, and we'll go from here to 1.5 and then straight up across the waistband. Now, if there were the most important part of this, I can't say there's the most important part, but right here, we want to make certain that those intersections of the seam where the waistband meets the pants align both sides. Otherwise, it's going to look a little odd there. So sometimes what I will do is I'll simply come in here and I'll sew right there first and check my work to verify it's going to be correct. We want to do the same thing at the waistband so that when the linings intersect, they'll be clean as well. And so again, 1/2 inch here at your notch, you start flaring to your angle at 1.5 at the waistband, and then come 1.5 inches straight up the waistband itself. Now that the center back seam is sewn, we can remove all of our basting stitches as well. We're going to press the seam allowance open all the way down, and then we're going to wrap the lining over the top of it, and eventually we'll sew this by hand to the back. Okay, And finally, one last belt loop will be stitched by hand right here at center back. On the fly side, where the hook goes, on the lining piece we need some stabilizer in there, otherwise that's going to rip out. So I simply take a piece of my canvas that I've prepared for my waistband, and I'm going to place it so that it's ever so slightly behind the sewing line. So I just follow that line up there, and I want it placed there. I'm going to baste it right along the edge here. Once I've done that, I'm just going to sew it to this leading edge here, just to hold it in place. We've placed our piece of stabilizer in there, sewed it. I'm going to place my waistband into place. I want to see how it looks. Now I'm working with the fly side, and there are 4 parts to a hook and bar. You have a hook, you have its washer, you've got the bar and its washer. The hook gets placed on the fly side. So I want to get this relative to where I think I need it to be. I want it to be centered to the waistband, and I want it to be directly above the teeth. Now if you're going to make an error, it's better to be a little bit inside of the teeth than too far outside the teeth, closer to the seam allowance. We want the loop part or the hook part to the back, or away from center front. Once I get a sense about where I think it should be, I'm just simply going to push through all layers. Once I'm pleased with that, I'm going to go ahead and lift up and push through. And there's 3 little barbs that will come through. I'm going to check my work just to verify it's where it needs to be, centered to the waistband and directly above the teeth. The washer is going to go in the same direction as the hook, and there's little indentations. You want those indentations concave. You don't want them looped up. That way the little barbs will sit inside. Now that we have it placed, we're going to go ahead and bend those barbs, the ones at the front toward the front, and the one at the back to the back. Make certain you don't bend them all in the same direction. It'll simply slip out of place. And there we have it. All good to go. Great. Now that we have that, we're ready for the hook part. Now that we have this now the hook is in place, we're ready for the bar. I'm simply going to zip the pant up and check my work and look for where I think that bar needs to be placed. And we're right there. In the ideal world, again, it's going to sit right above the zipper teeth. I just want to make certain that I have it in the same centered position. So I'm going to open it up a little bit here just to check to see where it is. I'm going to align the bar so that it's in the center and it's directly above the teeth. Give it a little press and then lift up. In this case, we're coming through the waistband canvas. There we are. We're going to check our placement, and it aligns nicely. Good. So we can go ahead and place our washer. And again, we want the concave facing us. And then we're going to press those barbs, and press towards center. I'll check my work one more time, because once this is in place, it's a lot of work to redo if it's not correct. And everything looks quite nice. The waistbands are aligning at the top, and the hooks are in place. Now we're ready to finish the front here. What we're going to do is we're going to fold these faces together, so lining face toward waistband faced, right on the fold line of the top of the waistband. It's very important. And you have that canvas right there to show you where it is. What we're going to do then is from this side, I find it more successful, is we're going to sew straight down the front. Make certain that we just capture, we don't want to capture the edge here, we want to sew right along the edge of here, just continuing the center front of the fly, straight up. Backstitch there, we'll trim all this excess out and we'll turn it to the other side. We'll do the same thing for the extension side. Fold into place right along the fold line at the top, and then we're going to sew following the line of the extension into the waistband. Trim the excess away and turn to the right side. So we've continued the line of the front extension straight up, backstitch, we trim the excess away and clip to the point. Make sure you don't clip through the stitch, just want to reduce the bulk there. We did the same thing over here. Follow the line up, trimmed, clip to the point. Now there's going to be a significant amount of bulk here, so I'm going to trim some of my support for my hook, just to get that out of there. There we go. Great. That'll make turning that a little bit easier, and don't be surprised that it's a little difficult to turn. It's going to be kind of stiff. Turn. There's my hook. Use my stiletto carefully to turn out this corner. And there we have the front edge on that side. And then we're ready for the front edge on this side. This turns a little more easily, but still, it's stiff. And there we have it. Great. Now that we've done that, we'll give ourselves a press. The final step in this process is simply to take all of our lining for the waistband, turn it underneath, and it's not a bad choice at this point to baste in place and then to blind stitch it all the way around the edge to finish. Once you've completed the waistband, you're ready for your hems. Find your finished length, mark it and measure down 2 inches from that, cut a straight line, overlock the edge, and then we'll turn it up, press in place, and blind hem, and your pants are complete.